You know that sinking feeling in your stomach when something just feels off? That was me the moment I picked up the phone and heard the babysitter's panicked voice. Leo's grandmother. She's here. She's burning things in the backyard. At first, I thought I misheard her. Burn? What could Margaret, my charming mother-in-law, possibly be burning? And why was she even at my house without telling me? But the shaky edge in her voice told me it wasn't a prank. My heart dropped. I was out the door before I even hung up, hands trembling so much I could barely start the car. As I drove home, the worst-case scenarios started playing like a horror movie in my head. Smoke rising from my son's room. Fire trucks in the driveway. The babysitter holding Leo, his little face tear-streaked, wondering why his world smelled like ash. But nothing could have prepared me for what I actually saw. When I pulled into the driveway, there it was, black smoke curling into the blue sky, coming from my backyard. I could smell it before I got out of the car. Plastic, fabric, something chemical, something familiar. I threw the car into park and ran, not caring if I tripped over my own feet. And then I saw her. Margaret stood in front of a bonfire, her posture rigid, like she was performing some kind of ancient ritual. She was wearing this ridiculous wide-brimmed sun hat, the kind you'd see on women sipping tea at a garden party. Except instead of holding a dainty teacup, she was clutching one of Leo's stuffed animals, a little giraffe he called Gigi. She tossed it into the flames like it was nothing, and I watched it twist and melt in the heat. "Margaret!" I screamed so loud my voice cracked. She turned slowly, like I was the one interrupting her. Her face was this bizarre mix of calm and smug, like she genuinely believed she was doing something righteous. "You're just in time," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she's perfected over the years. "I'm almost done purging the house of evil." Evil? Did she actually say or evil? I didn't have time to process her words because Leo's toys, his clothes, even that handmade quilt my grandmother gave him, the one she spent months stitching before she passed, all of it was smoldering in the fire. I couldn't even yell at her, my throat closed up. For a second, I just stood there, feeling every ounce of rage, disbelief, and heartbreak bubble to the surface. When I finally found my voice, it came out sharp and broken. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I'm protecting Leo," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Those things you let him play with, they're corrupting him. A boy shouldn't have such violent, chaotic influences. And the clothes? They're too bright, too flashy. It's not appropriate." I wanted to scream at her, shake her, demand to know what kind of twisted logic led her to think burning my son's belongings was okay. But before I could say anything, Chris, my husband, showed up. Chris had always been the diplomat between us. He was the kind of guy who could smooth over any argument with a calm voice and a logical explanation. But when he saw the fire, the look on his face was pure rage. "Mom, what the hell is this?" he shouted, running over to me. She gave him the same patronizing look she always reserved for me. "Christopher, you should be thanking me. I'm doing what you refuse to do, what's best for Leo." "What's best for Leo?" I snapped, finally finding my voice. "You think what's best for him is setting fire to everything he loves? To his home?" That's when the police showed up. Someone, probably a neighbor, had called them about the smoke. And honestly, seeing those flashing lights felt like a lifeline. I wanted them to arrest her. Right then and there. I wanted her to face consequences for once in her life. But Chris begged me to let him handle it privately, to not escalate things. And here's the thing, I almost agreed. Almost. But then, as the police were leaving, Margaret turned to me, her voice low but full of venom, and said, "If your son turns out damaged, just remember I tried to save him." That was it. That was the moment I decided she wasn't going to get away with it this time. Chris begged me to give him time to sort this out with his mom. He always thought he could fix her. But this wasn't just another of Margaret's backhanded comments or passive-aggressive digs. She had crossed every possible line, and all I could see when I looked at her was the smoke rising from that fire, carrying away pieces of my son's life. I told Chris that if he wanted to sort it out, he could do it alone. As for me, I was calling a lawyer. I was done playing peacemaker in a game Margaret had rigged from the start. That night, as I put Leo to bed, he looked up at me with his big, curious eyes, and asked, "Mommy, where's Gigi?" My heart shattered. What do you say to a child when their favorite toy has been reduced to ashes? I kissed his forehead and told him Gigi had gone on an adventure. "We'll find something new tomorrow, okay?" He nodded, but the way his little mouth trembled almost broke me. That was when I knew this wasn't just about stuff. Margaret hadn't just burned toys or clothes. She'd stolen pieces of his joy, his comfort, his innocence. The next morning, I called the lawyer. Chris begged me not to. He offered to replace everything Margaret had destroyed, even pay out of his savings. But that wasn't the point. "It's not about the money," I told him, my voice barely steady. "It's about the principle. She has to face consequences, Chris. If not for me, for Leo." Margaret, of course, acted like I was the villain. When she got the letter from the lawyer demanding $10,000 for damages, she called Chris in tears, accusing me of ruining the family. She told him I was punishing her for being a good Christian woman trying to protect her grandson. That's the thing about Margaret. She knows exactly how to twist the narrative to suit her. Chris was stuck in the middle, as always. He hated confrontation, and I could see how much this was tearing him apart. He'd say things like, "You know how she is," as if that excused her behavior. But what hurt most was when he started saying I was too harsh or not thinking about the bigger picture. What bigger picture? My priority was Leo, not Margaret's fragile ego. Then came the family interventions. First, Chris's uncle called me, trying to mediate. "Margaret's been through a lot," he said, his voice soft, like he thought pity would win me over. "Losing her husband, now this. You have to understand, she's not herself." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Not herself? Burning my child's things wasn't a grief response. It was calculated cruelty. When Margaret couldn't guilt-trip me directly, she started spinning her web elsewhere. She told anyone who'd listen that I was bleeding her dry financially, that I was out to destroy her. But here's the kicker. She also claimed that Leo's toys had exploded on their own, and she'd burned the rest to prevent a fire hazard. It was so absurd I almost admired her audacity. Almost. Despite all this, Chris still clung to the hope that we could move past it. "She's my mom," he said one night, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't just cut her out of my life." I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to ask why his loyalty to her mattered more than his loyalty to Leo, or to me. But instead I just said, "She's your mom, but Leo is your son. Where does your priority lie?" Things between us started to crack after that. We didn't fight, exactly. It was more like a quiet war, with both of us retreating into ourselves. I couldn't trust him to put Leo first anymore, and he couldn't understand why I couldn't just let it go. The therapist in me knew this was the beginning of the end, but the wife in me still hoped we could fix it. Then I found out Chris was still seeing Margaret. I noticed how he'd suddenly started leaving the house early on Saturdays, claiming he needed time to think. At first, I believed him. But something about the way he avoided eye contact when I asked where he'd been. I knew. So one Saturday, I followed him. Sure enough, he drove straight to Margaret's apartment. I didn't confront him then. I waited until he got home, my stomach churning the entire time. When he walked through the door, I asked, "So, how was your walk?" He froze, and that was all the confirmation I needed. When I told him I'd followed him, he didn't even try to deny it. "She's still my mom," he said, like that was supposed to make it okay. That night, I realized I couldn't keep doing this. Chris wasn't just failing me, he was failing Leo. I told him if he wanted to keep Margaret in his life, that was his choice. But I wouldn't have her anywhere near my son. And if he couldn't respect that boundary, then maybe he wasn't the partner, or father, I thought he was. Chris promised to stop seeing her after that, but it was too little, too late. The damage was done. Margaret had burned more than Leo's toys that day. She'd burned the trust between Chris and me. And no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't put out the fire she started. Chris and I tried to move forward, but every step felt like walking on shards of glass. The tension was unbearable, and even when we weren't actively arguing, the silence between us carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. I threw myself into work and taking care of Leo, but deep down, I felt like I was treading water, just trying to stay afloat in a marriage that was slowly sinking. Then came the morning I got the call from our babysitter, again. Her voice was shaky, panicked, but this time it wasn't about a fire. "Margaret's here," she whispered. "She's standing outside the house, asking to see Leo." I told her no, but she won't leave. I raced home, heart pounding, terrified of what I'd find. Margaret wasn't just standing outside, she was banging on the door like a woman possessed, shouting something about how she deserved to see her grandson. When she saw me pull into the driveway, she stormed up to my car, her face twisted with anger and desperation. "You can't keep him from me forever," she yelled, her voice trembling. "I've paid for my mistakes. I've suffered enough." I didn't even get out of the car. I rolled down the window just enough for her to hear me. "Margaret, leave now, or I'll call the police. And this time, I'll make sure they take you away." She froze, her eyes narrowing. "You wouldn't dare," she spat. "Try me," I said, my voice icy. Margaret stood there for a moment, weighing her options. Then she turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath, and got into her car. I watched her drive away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. That was the last straw. The very next morning, I called my lawyer and filed for a restraining order. Chris, of course, wasn't thrilled when I told him. "She's just upset," he said, like that excused her behavior. "She doesn't know how to handle being cut off from her family." "She's not being cut off from her family, Chris," I snapped. "She's being cut off from my son. There's a difference." The restraining order was granted, but Margaret didn't take it seriously. A few weeks later, I caught Chris sneaking off with Leo to run errands. I had a sinking feeling I knew what he was really up to, so I followed them, again. Sure enough, he drove straight to Margaret's house. I felt a surge of betrayal so strong it left me shaking. I parked down the street and waited until they went inside, then stormed up to the door. When Margaret opened it, the smug smile on her face nearly sent me over the edge. "You're breaking the restraining order," I said through gritted teeth. Margaret crossed her arms. "It's not illegal if he brought Leo here willingly," she said, nodding toward Chris, who was standing awkwardly in the living room, clearly caught off guard. I didn't bother arguing. I pulled out my phone, snapped a few photos, and scooped Leo up into my arms. "We're leaving," I told Chris, my voice cold and final. Back at home, I told Chris to pack his things and leave. He tried to apologize, tried to explain, but I was done listening. "You've chosen her over us too many times," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't trust you anymore." The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and paperwork. I filed for divorce and full custody of Leo, using the photos and the restraining order violations as evidence. Chris tried to fight me at first, but eventually, he realized he didn't have a leg to stand on. Margaret, of course, didn't go quietly. She spread rumors to anyone who would listen, painting me as the villain who had destroyed her family. She even tried to rally Chris's relatives against me, but most of them were tired of her drama and stayed out of it. Through it all, I stayed focused on Leo. He was my anchor, my reason for pushing through the chaos. Every time I saw him smile or heard him laugh, it reminded me why I was doing this. I wasn't just fighting for custody, I was fighting for his safety, his happiness, his future. By the time the custody hearing rolled around, I was emotionally exhausted but resolute. The judge reviewed the evidence, the photos, the restraining order, Margaret's history, and granted me full custody. Chris was given visitation rights, but only under strict supervision. Margaret, thankfully, was barred from any contact with Leo. When I left the courthouse that day, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could breathe. But as much as I wanted to celebrate, I knew this wasn't the end. Margaret wasn't the kind of person to give up easily. Even so, I promised myself one thing: I wouldn't let her, or anyone, hurt Leo again. Not now, not ever. A few months after the custody hearing, things started to settle, at least on the surface. Chris moved out, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without tiptoeing around someone else's loyalties. Leo adjusted faster than I expected, though he'd sometimes ask, "When's Daddy coming to play?" Those moments stung, but I always told him the truth in a way he could understand. "Daddy will visit soon, sweetheart. For now, it's just you and me, okay?" Margaret, however, was not done. I don't know what part of no contact she thought was negotiable, but she found ways to make her presence felt. One morning, I found a small package on my porch. No note, no return address, just a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a photo album filled with pictures of Chris as a child. His baby photos, his first birthday, and even a few awkward middle school portraits. At first, I didn't understand what it was supposed to mean. But tucked in the back was a handwritten note. Leo deserves to know his roots, no matter what you think. My hands shook as I read it. This wasn't just defiance. It was a threat, a reminder that she wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. I showed the package to my lawyer, who advised me to document everything. He said it wasn't enough to press charges, but it was a clear violation of boundaries. I kept the album, though, tucked away in a box I labeled evidence. Then, Chris started pushing back against the supervised visitation arrangement. "It's humiliating," he said during one of our drop-offs. "I'm not some criminal, and Leo deserves better than this circus." I reminded him, calmly but firmly, that this arrangement existed because he had broken my trust by bringing Leo to Margaret. "You don't get to rewrite history, Chris. This is the bed you made." Still, he found ways to needle at me. He started showing up late for his visits or canceling at the last minute, leaving Leo disappointed and confused. It felt like another form of control, like he was trying to punish me for taking a stand. But I refused to let it get to me. Every time he flaked, I made the day extra special for Leo. Trips to the park, ice cream, even movie nights with popcorn in bed. If Chris thought he could wear me down, he was wrong. And then came the escalation. One Friday afternoon, I came home from work to find my living room window shattered. Glass littered the carpet, and on the couch sat a single brick. Attached to it was a piece of paper with 2 words scrawled in messy, angry handwriting: "You'll pay." My first thought was Margaret. Who else would go to these lengths? I called the police, filed a report, and sent a picture of the note to my lawyer. I didn't hear from her directly after that, but the message was clear. She wasn't going to let this go. That night, as I sat in bed with Leo sleeping soundly beside me, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: fear. Not just for myself, but for him. What kind of person would throw a brick through a window where a child lived? I didn't sleep much that night, and by morning, I'd made a decision. I was done waiting for Margaret's next move. The restraining order wasn't enough. I called my lawyer first thing and told him I wanted to push for criminal charges: destruction of property, harassment, anything we could prove. He warned me that it could get messy, that Margaret would fight back, but I didn't care. "Let her fight," I said. "She's not winning this." Chris, predictably, was furious when he found out. "She's my mother," he snapped during a phone call. "She's just grieving, and you're kicking her while she's down." "She threw a brick through my window," I reminded him, my voice sharp. "She put Leo at risk, and you're still defending her?" He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he hung up on me, and I didn't hear from him for a week. When the charges were finally filed, Margaret's response was exactly what I expected. She played the victim, claiming she had no idea who would do such a thing and accusing me of fabricating evidence to ruin her life. But this time, I didn't care what story she told. I had photos, police reports, and a mountain of witnesses to back me up. The court date is set for next month, and while part of me dreads seeing her in that courtroom, another part of me feels ready. For the first time in this entire nightmare, I feel like I'm taking control back. Margaret may have started this war, but I'm going to be the one to end it. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Or maybe it was just me, nerves making everything sharper, harsher. Margaret sat across the room, her face a mask of indignation, as if she were the one being wronged. Chris was there too, sitting a few rows behind her, his expression unreadable. I didn't look at him for long. I couldn't. The prosecutor laid everything out: the restraining order Margaret had violated, the brick through my window, the threatening note. My lawyer had been meticulous in gathering evidence: photos, police reports, even a copy of the package she'd left with that ridiculous photo album. Margaret's lawyer tried to spin it all as a series of misunderstandings, but the evidence was damning. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she didn't even try to hide her disdain. She stood there, clutching her pearls. Literally, she wore this gaudy string of pearls like she was auditioning for a role as the wronged matriarch, and launched into a tirade about how I'd poisoned her relationship with her son and grandson. "She's manipulated Christopher," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "She's turned my family against me, and now she wants to punish me for being a loving grandmother." I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I let my lawyer handle it, and he did not hold back. "Loving grandmothers don't set fire to their grandsons' belongings," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "They don't throw bricks through windows or leave threatening notes. This isn't about love. It's about control." Margaret's mask slipped for just a moment, her lips pressing into a thin, angry line. She knew she was losing. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision. Margaret was found guilty of violating the restraining order and ordered to pay damages for the broken window. She was also sentenced to probation and required to attend court-mandated counseling. It wasn't the harshest punishment, but it was enough to send a message. She couldn't keep getting away with this. After the verdict, Margaret shot me a look so venomous it could have curdled milk. I didn't care. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt lighter, like I'd finally reclaimed a piece of my life. But the victory was bittersweet. Chris didn't say a word to me as I passed him. I could tell he was furious, not at his mother but at me. Later that evening, he sent me a message. "This was unnecessary. You've made things worse for everyone." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Chris had made his choice long ago, and it wasn't us. Over the next few weeks, I focused on Leo. I didn't want him to feel the weight of all this, so I poured my energy into creating a sense of normalcy for him. We painted his room a new color, bought a few new toys to replace the ones he'd lost, and even adopted a little rescue dog he named Milo. But Margaret wasn't finished. A few days after the court ruling, I heard from Chris's uncle again. He told me Margaret was still devastated and suggested I reconsider letting her see Leo under supervision. I nearly laughed. "This isn't about her feelings," I said firmly. "It's about Leo's safety." The final straw came a month later. Margaret sent another letter, this time directly to Leo. It was full of the same manipulative nonsense she'd used before, telling him she missed him and hoped he'd grow up to understand the truth about what happened. She even slipped in a dig about me, saying she hoped he wouldn't inherit my stubbornness. I took the letter straight to my lawyer. This was harassment, plain and simple. He filed another motion, this time to extend the restraining order indefinitely. When the judge approved it, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could see a future without Margaret looming over us. Chris and I finalized the divorce shortly after, and I was granted full custody of Leo. He'd still have visitation with Chris, but only under strict guidelines, and Margaret was explicitly barred from any contact. I decided to move closer to my parents, a fresh start for Leo and me. Packing up the house was bittersweet, but as I folded the last of Leo's clothes into a box, I felt something I hadn't in years: hope. Margaret may have tried to break us, but she didn't win. And as I watched Leo chase Milo around the yard one last time before we left, I knew we were going to be okay.